These are the texts that will be used in congregations that use the common lectionary. And these texts will be used the third Sunday of Lent, which this year is March the 3rd. The first text comes from the book of Exodus, the 20th chapter, and it is a rendition of the Ten Commandments. You know, there are two places where there are the Ten Commandments. The other is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The similarities are pretty plain to see. What I want to highlight has to do with, I think, the spirit of the Ten Commandments. Some people consider them restrictive. I rather think of them as protecting the freedom of people. And with that, I want to jump to the last six first, and then I'm going to move back to what really is the most important part from which all of them fall. But the last six have to do with community, how we live in community. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave, ox and donkey, etc. Now, in those commandments, what I like to think of is, are they really God trying to keep God's thumb on us? Or do these give us permission for freedom? And I think it's the second. I mean, I like to think of it this way. Is the world a better place if we honored parents less, if we murdered more, committed more adultery, committed more stealing, lied about our neighbors more often, as in court, false testimony, and coveted the things that we don't have? Now, would the world be better if that's how we behaved? I think that to put the Ten Commandments in that context shows that the intention by God was to give us a better life as opposed to a smaller, more fearful life, a life that empowers versus a life that restricts. So I think that's an important way to see all of the commandments. Now let's go back to the first four and see the context in which all 10 begin, and see why the last six about community, in my mind, are built on these first four. The commandments begin with the most important notion of all of the Old Testament, or all the New Testament for that matter. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's how it begins. So here's how the covenant starts. It doesn't start with an agreement between people, a bargain between people. I'll do this if you do that. It starts with a declaration of rescue, a declaration of you belong to me because I have done this great thing for you. And so it means that everything else that comes is in simple response. When somebody does something nice for you, we often ask in ourselves, how do we say thank you? How do we demonstrate our thanks? And that's exactly what these commandments do, is they become a grateful response to the rescue of God. So for the people of Israel, obviously it was the grateful response for rescue out of the land of Egypt. They have done nothing for it. It's happened. And so God offers this grateful response. Here's how you can respond. The first thing it does, of course, it begins with, you shall have no other gods before me. Notice what I think is a very provocative understanding on the part of God of who the people are. God does not say there are no other gods. God's first command is you'll have no other gods before me. It is a genuine recognition that the children of Israel, who were heirs of the promise of Abraham and had longed for a rescuer for hundreds of years while they were in Egypt. This is, in fact, that God understands that over these hundreds of years, they have been subject to other gods, that they probably simply see Yahweh as one among many. And there are plenty of other places in the Old Testament where worship of other gods crops up. But this is God's way of working with the people where they are in their moment in history. And their moment in history includes a multitude of gods. So the first grateful response is, ignore those, worship just me. Don't have any other gods before me. The second one is similar to that, and this is again more guidance to help the people. Don't make graven images, which is basically to say, I, the Lord your God, am undefinable in the way that you would like to define things. You can't really shape me, form me, identify me with any particular image at all. So don't even bother to try to do that. It also helps prevent the people from forming images and deciding that those images themselves, all by themselves, are sacred and symbolic of the Lord who is undefinable. That also shows us something about our own contemporary setting, does it not? To where we struggle with anything that we cannot define. And God is declaring right from the beginning, you can't really box me in with any thing. Faith is not a box for us. Faith rather is this sense, almost this inexplicable sense beyond ourselves, in which we have a recognition that God has been at work in life. So it not only was something for the people in Moses' own time, it is also a decree for us and a general reminder that there's no way we can box God in. In the same way, the next commandment as well about you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain is very similar to this second one about idol worship and shaping forms and claiming that somehow those are identifiable and definable elements about our God. And this is not so much the dirty word kind of a notion, but more that this belief that we can control the work of God by invoking God's name, particularly when we're mad at somebody else, but that we can control about God because we know God, and therefore God becomes sort of our magic genie. And the third commandment basically says that doesn't work. Don't even try it. Don't even imagine that you can do it. And I think that, again, for us in our day and time, where we see a lot of things in prosperity theology, which are basically in defiance of this kind of a commandment, the prosperity theology that implies that somehow if we do the right things, then God's going to do these other right things for us. That, in fact, is attempting to use God in this inappropriate way and using God in vain, we might say. Then the next one, I like the commentary that comes with this in the Exodus shaping of the Ten Commandments. After it says 6 days you shall work and the seventh day you shall rest, and it enumerates that everybody's supposed to have this day of rest. Why? Because in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them, but rested on the seventh. Therefore, do as your God does and rest. That's why you're giving this day of rest, because even God rests. So it sets it up in a cosmic kind of way based on creation. In Deuteronomy, it adds a little ingredient to that speaks about them having been enslaved in Egypt, which implies that they had no time of rest. And so a time of rest then becomes a way of celebrating once more the rescue of God. So that would be an interesting comparison. I encourage you to look at Deuteronomy 5 as well as Exodus 20 to see those subtle little differences in the time and context in which the commandments are given. Psalm 19 is the psalm of the day, and it ends with some very familiar words that many ministers use before they preach, although they change them a little bit. The last verse of Psalm, the 14th verse is the last verse of Psalm 19. The last verse is, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's often changed in worship by pastors to say, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable. I shouldn't have said it that way. It makes it sound like I'm mocking the ministers that do that. I'm not. I don't mean it that way. But they changed it from my words, my meditation, to our meditation. I think that's a fine way to do it, but I want to look at the psalm particularly for what it is setting up. I suggest that this psalm, which isn't very long, 14 verses, so I encourage you to read the whole psalm, which is the lectionary text in toto for this week. It begins with, the heavens are telling the glory of God. And there's a phrase in there, a very poetic phrase, that I think captures what the psalmist is trying to say about how the heavens tell of God's glory. There is no speech, he says in verse 3, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In other words, it is speaking without speaking. It's that, what shall we say, that inexplicable sense of recognizing the majesty and glory of God simply by looking around at the world, whether it's in the beauty of a thing we see or in the awesome power, say, of a thunderstorm or a volcano. This whole creative order speaks of enormous creativity and power. There's more description in that section. Then there's an abrupt shift. Some authorities suggest that this abrupt shift means this was another psalm that had been put together with this one. I don't think so. I think this is a deliberate poetic attempt to help us to think of basically three dimensions in which we grasp the ungraspable God. Verse 7 begins, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. And on it goes, speaking about God's law. Now, God's law is something we can see, hear, and we can enact in our lives. Think back to the 10 Commandments we just discussed. Now, granted, to pay heed to the Apostle Paul, the law is a tutor for us, meaning it not only teaches us how to behave, but it shows us how we miss the mark as well. But in here, we've now jumped from the inexplicable understanding of God that we encounter with the majesty of nature to something that we can grasp very concretely in our lives, and that is the law of the Lord, and how we may live more or less within the law and by the law of the Lord. It's very tangible. Inexplicable, the heavens; tangible, the law. And then finally, at the very end, that last phrase, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. I like the meditation of my heart in addition to that. In essence, what the psalmist has done is put into words the inexplicable of the majesty of God in creation, the tangible in the law of God. And then this last thing, the meditation of my heart. Probably we all have this same experience of things rushing through our head and sometimes crystallizing with an amazing insight that we cannot quite put into words. It's internal, and when we try to express it, we just can't quite do it, but it's here. And so in this one psalm, I think we have all three human encounters with God. The majesty of nature, which is beyond our words in many ways. The law of the Lord, which is within our practice in many ways. And those meditations of our heart, which are those things that are just beyond our concrete expressions, but they're there. We know them. So a great, to me, celebration of the personal encounter with the eternal, which is our Heavenly Father. 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, some pretty familiar words. And I think it's always important to keep in mind the brilliance of Paul. And yet, even at the end of the day, Paul knows that there is something beyond his enormous grasp of human knowledge. And this is what we have in here. He's trying to put, I guess you could say he's trying to put into words the essence of the gospel. And so here's how he does it. The message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Well, Paul's already very wise. He's also extraordinarily discerning. We witness that throughout the New Testament in how he's able to identify the proper ways to convey the one true gospel in a variety of different cultural settings without ever watering down the gospel. I mean, this is wisdom and discernment of the highest nature. And yet what Paul is telling us in this particular text is that there is something about the salvation plan of God which does not appeal to our wisdom. It does not appeal to our discernment. It has appeal only by our experience of that salvific encounter with God, that thing that's almost, well, Paul might even say beyond wisdom. Paul goes on, Jews demand signs, Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Greeks, or folly to the Gentiles. But, he says, to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness stronger than human strength. I think when Paul speaks of God's weakness there, it is the weakness of Christ on the cross, who willfully submits to death as a human being and genuinely breathes a last breath in the midst of deep pain and dies. And yet at the same time, in that weakness, what does Jesus say at the very end? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Even in weakness, there is this power, this strength that's beyond anything that we can understand. We're almost beyond anything that we can comprehend, except by the experience that we have been forgiven. The last text is from John chapter 2. Keep in mind that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as synoptic gospels. That means they tell the synopsis, the story of the life of Jesus. John has entirely different purposes. And the reason I set this up, when we try to think of John's purpose, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the overturning of the money changers' tables and the driving out of the animals from the temple is at the end of Jesus' ministry and is actually thought of as a cause for those who want to seek Jesus out to kill him. John pulls it out of that place because what John sees in this is something a lot more descriptive of Jesus' encounter with people in his entire ministry. You almost maybe to say it's more metaphorical of his encounter with people in his ministry. And so in John chapter 2, so here early in John's gospel, Jesus goes into the temple and he does the things that we have seen in the others too. It is the time of the Passover, and so that means there's even more people in Jerusalem. Excuse me, more people in Jerusalem at Passover time than at any other time. Also, it will be around the time of Passover when the apostles are all gathered in the upper room and the Holy Spirit falls on them, and so many people from all over the world who have come to Jerusalem hear the noise and come rushing, and they hear the gospel being proclaimed in all of their own languages. But the story is what we expect here. You know, he makes a whip, he drives out the money changers, turns over their tables, and so forth and so on. Then there's some things that clearly the people don't understand. Part of that inexplicable sense of the encounter with the Almighty again. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace, he says. John then writes a little commentary. The disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Then the Jews all say, well, what sign can you give for what you're doing? And Jesus says something that seems inexplicable to them, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And then the Jews say, well, wait a minute, this temple's been under construction for 46 years. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? Then John writes in the aside here that Jesus doesn't explain at that moment, which is that the temple he was referring to was his own body. And after he'd been raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. So even to his disciples at this time, they're kind of going, huh? What's he talking about? And there are a lot of places in John where humans do a thing or make a statement, and Jesus' response would leave them going, huh? What's he talking about? So that only well after the fact and looking back could someone go, aha, I think I understand. And so that's what's going on throughout this text, is this setup for much that happens in the ministry of Jesus, that there are things in his earthly ministry that people simply aren't going to be able to grasp, but after the resurrection, they will understand, at least they will understand by faith. So we might sum up, and I will go back to the psalm for just a moment then. There are things about our faith that are, in fact, inexplicable. There are things about our faith that are tangible. And there are things about our faith that are so internal we simply cannot comprehend them or cannot take them from the comprehension within and put words to them. I hope this is good for you, and that this will be of benefit to you as you prepare for that next Sunday of Lent. See you next week.